In a town like Clear River, Ohio, love is a debt you're born into. My name is Sarah Anderson, and for my entire life, I've been the one paying it. I was the good daughter, the sensible one quietly funneling my own future, my escape fund, into a black hole to cover for my golden boy brother. I thought I knew how much they'd take. I thought I knew the cost of being family. Then came the Thanksgiving, when my mother called me a burden, and I found out I hadn't been paying a debt. I'd been funding my own execution. But what happens when the burden finally fights back? Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. In my family, love was a ledger, and for 29 years I was the only one paying in. I live in Clear River, Ohio, a town that clings to the banks of the sluggish brown river it's named after, and holds onto its people just as tight. It's a place of front porch flags and Friday night football, a place where everyone knows your name, your business, and your lineage. My name is Sarah Anderson, and I'm the town's historical archivist. I work in the quiet, dusty basement of the library, surrounded by brittle maps and the scent of old paper. I love it. I love the concrete truth of it, the way history, unlike people, can't lie about what it is. My mother, Carol, calls it a dusty hobby. She prefers to talk about my older brother, Mark. Mark is the prodigal son, the charismatic high-energy comet who burns bright and fast, leaving a trail of scorched earth and unpaid debts in his wake. He's the one who gets out, who builds things, who's always on the verge of his next big break. My father, David, is the man caught in the middle. Worn down by a lifetime of factory work and acting as Carol's emotional ballast, he just wants to keep the peace, which is town speak for letting Mark and Carol do whatever they want. And I'm Sarah, reliable Sarah, sensible, quiet, good old Sarah, the one who stayed, the one who picks up the pieces, the one who pays the bills. 5 years ago, the roof on my parents' house was leaking. At least that's what my mother told me, her voice a practiced performance of minor panic. They needed to fix it before the winter rains, and they just needed a little help. They wanted to take out a home equity line of credit, a HELOC, and the bank just needed a co-signer to feel secure. I was 24, naive and desperate for the approval I never got. I signed. The roof, I found out later, was fine. The $5,000 repair was seed money for Mark's first failed startup, a gourmet jerky of the month club. By the time I found out, the money was gone, and the payments were due. My parents forgot about them. So I paid $450 every single month for 5 straight years. It was the good daughter's tax. That $450 was my penance for being the one who wasn't a star. It was also the exact amount I was supposed to be putting into my escape fund. That fund was my secret, the one true thing I owned. It was my one-way ticket to a bigger city, anywhere really, where I could be an anonymous archivist, drink coffee, without running into my third-grade teacher, and maybe finally breathe. Instead, the fund was a joke, a dwindling anemic number in a savings account that I fed with scraps. Life in Clear River became a series of small, suffocating obligations. Sarah, honey. Mom would call always at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday, right when I was in the middle of cataloging. I need a ride to the podiatrist. You're just in that dusty basement, you can come get me. No, please, no, are you busy? Just the assumption that my time was public property. When Mark would breeze into town, he'd take us all out to the local steakhouse hold court with his glittering stories of venture capital and high-stakes meetings. And then when the bill came, he'd pat his expensive jeans. Whoops, he'd laugh, a movie star flash of teeth. Left my wallet in the rental car. Sorry, you got this right, I'm good for it. He was never good for it. And my mother would just beam at him, at his audacity, his confidence. Then she'd turn to me, my hand trembling as I slid my card, the one I paid the HELOC with, to the waitress. It's so nice you found such a simple life, honey, she'd say, patting my arm, the simple hanging in the air like an insult. No stress, no big risks, just quiet. My stress was a knot in my stomach that never unwound. My risk was that I would die in this town, buried under the weight of my family's expectations. Yesterday, that knot cinched tight. My mother called her voice electric with an excitement she never used for me. He's coming home. Mark's flying in for Thanksgiving. I could hear my dad in the background, a low murmur of, "Now, Carol." "Oh, hush, David," she trilled. "He has big news, Sarah. The biggest news. He says it's going to change everything." I stood in the silence of the archive, the smell of decaying paper filling my lungs, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty basement. In my family, big news was just a bill I hadn't received yet. Which is why I'm here at the Clear River Community Bank, standing on the same worn linoleum floor I've stood on for 60 straight months. It's the day before Thanksgiving, and the HELOC payment is due. I have to transfer the money from my meager checking account, leaving just enough to cover gas and my one small contribution to the feast, a pumpkin pie from the store, because I'm not a baker like Carol. I'm transferring my last $500, which will zero me out until my paycheck hits next week. The escape fund is a phantom, a ghost of a number on the screen. The teller, Jenny Peterson, an old acquaintance from high school who married a dentist and settled, gives me a sad, knowing smile. She's seen me do this every month for half a decade. "Saving up for something big, Sarah?" she asks, her voice kind, which almost makes it worse. I look at the gray, drizzling Ohio rain outside at the Christmas decorations, already strung up across Main Street, and I force a smile that feels like breaking glass. You have no idea. Thanksgiving in my family wasn't about gratitude. It was a performance. And that year, I was the only one who didn't know their lines. The house was already too hot when I arrived, thick with the smell of roasting turkey, a layer of simmering resentment just underneath. My store-bought pumpkin pie was relegated to the corner of the counter to make room for the real desserts, as Mom put it, gesturing to her 3 perfect from-scratch creations. I just nodded, the familiar knot in my stomach tightening. Mark arrived an hour late, smelling of expensive cologne and airport lounge coffee, all dazzling teeth and feigned surprise. "Sar, look at you still holding down the fort," he boomed, kissing the air near my cheek, before enveloping our mother in a hug that was pure theater. My father, David, just clapped him on the back, already looking more alive than he had all year. Dinner was Mark's stage, and we were his captive audience. He spun a glittering, hypnotic web of words, a pitch he'd clearly rehearsed. It was a crypto real estate venture. He used phrases like decentralized land assets, and metaverse architecture, and blockchain-verified zoning. It was a magnificent, shimmering cloud of absolute nonsense, but he delivered it with the conviction of a televangelist. My mother was enraptured, her eyes wide, hanging on every syllable. My father nodded along, looking both impressed and profoundly confused, which was his default state around Mark. "It's the future, Dad. The future," Mark said, leaning forward, his voice dropping to a confidential, urgent tone. "It's ground floor, but the window is closing fast. I need one last round of seed money to get us to full launch." My mother, Carol, practically vibrated with excitement. She picked up her fork and clinked it against her water glass, a makeshift toast. "Well, speaking of big news," she beamed, her gaze sweeping over us, but landing as it always did on Mark. "Your father and I have an announcement to go with Mark's." She reached over and grabbed David's hand. He tried to smile, but it looked more like a grimace. "We've decided to go all in on our boy. We're taking out a second mortgage on the house." The fork in my hand clattered against the plate. The air in the hot, stuffy room went thin and cold. "You can't," I said. My voice was so small I wasn't sure I'd said it aloud. Carol laughed, a high, brittle sound. "Oh, Sarah, don't be such a wet blanket. It's just a formality. The bank's already pre-approved it." "No," I said louder this time. The table went utterly silent. Mark's smile flickered. "You can't. The bank won't let you. You're already leveraged. The HELOC." Carol's face hardened. The festive mask dropped, revealing the cold annoyance beneath. "Sarah, please," she hissed. "Don't be so dramatic. It's just a little loan. We're handling it." The lie, the one I had carried for 5 years, suddenly became too heavy to hold. It felt like I was choking on it. No, you're not. I said the words finally tumbling out raw and shaking. I am. I've been handling it. I've been paying it for 5 years, Mom. Every single month. $450. It's why I'm still here. It's why I have no savings. I'm drowning. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a vacuum. I looked at my mother, my heart hammering, pleading with my eyes for her to finally see me, to understand what I had given up. Mark just smirked, took a long, slow sip of his wine, and looked out the window, bored by the interruption. And my father, my quiet peacekeeping father, just stared at his plate. He picked up his knife and began to meticulously saw at a piece of turkey. He wouldn't look at me. Carol's face went through a rapid series of emotions, shock, embarrassment, and then settling on a cold reptilian fury. She placed her hand on Mark's, a deliberate public gesture of solidarity, a drawing of a line. Well, Sarah, she said, her voice dripping with a pity that was worse than any anger. At least Mark is building something. He's trying to make a life. We all have to sacrifice. She paused, took a sip of her own wine, and then she looked right at me, her eyes as dead as stones. She delivered the line that shattered everything. You're just a burden, honey. You've always been a burden. Burden. The word didn't just hang in the air. It hit me like a physical blow. It echoed in the silence, the final verdict on my entire life. All the payments, all the rides, all the swallowed back words, all the quiet, sensible, reliable years, just a burden. I looked at my father, who was still dissecting his food, a coward. I looked at Mark, who was now checking his phone under the table. A strange, cold calm washed over me. The knot in my stomach didn't just unwind, it vaporized. I put down my fork. I slowly, deliberately placed my napkin on the table next to my untouched plate. My chair scraped against the hardwood floor, a sound as loud as a gunshot in the silent room. I stood up. My mother looked up, startled, her script interrupted. Sarah, where are you going? Sit down, don't make a scene. I looked at her, really looked at her, and I saw a stranger. You're right, I said, my voice perfectly steady, perfectly clear. I'm done being a burden. I turned and walked out of the dining room. I didn't get my coat. I walked out the front door into the cold, sharp November air. The door slammed shut behind me. I got into my car and just drove, not home, but to the dark, empty lookout point over the river. I parked and stared at the black, moving water. The numbness faded, replaced by a pure, cold, righteous anger. I pulled out my phone. The bank's app glowed in the darkness. I logged in. I navigated to scheduled transfers. I saw it $450 to Clear River Bank. HELOC payment. Scheduled deck first. My thumb hovered over the cancel button. Are you sure you want to cancel this scheduled payment? I pressed. Confirm. Payment canceled. The ledger was closed. I thought the silence that followed Thanksgiving was a victory. Turns out, it was just the sound of a fuse burning down to the dynamite. The first week was pure cold liberation. No calls, no texts, no passive-aggressive emails. I went to work at the archive, breathed in the familiar, comforting scent of old paper, and for the first time, I didn't feel like I was just biding my time. I felt like I was living. Every dollar I earned, I put directly into my escape fund. I started rebuilding the wall they had forced me to tear down, brick by painful brick. I was free. I'd finally done it. I'd finally walked away. But I forgot one crucial detail in a town like Clear River: you're never allowed to just walk away. The whispers started at the grocery store. Averted eyes in the produce section. A sudden hush when I walked down the canned goods aisle. Then came the prayers. Old Mrs. Gable, my mother's closest friend, cornered me by the checkout, her hands clasping mine in a grip like a steel trap. Sarah, dear, she'd whispered, her perfume a suffocating cloud of synthetic lavender. We are all just praying for you. It's a terrible thing what you're going through. Your mother is just... Well, she's beside herself with worry. I pulled my hand back. Worry about what, Mrs. Gable? Her eyes widened with practiced sympathy. Oh, honey, we all know how difficult things can get. How overwhelming. Abandoning your family like that. That was the narrative they were spinning. I wasn't an adult woman who had set a boundary. I was unstable. I was difficult. I was having a breakdown and had abandoned poor loving Carol and David. The betrayal of it was a physical weight, a sour taste in my mouth. I was a monster for not setting myself on fire to keep them warm. Needing an anchor, something real to hold on to in the sea of lies. I found myself walking into the Clear River Community Center. It was a rundown brick building near the old train tracks, a place I'd driven past 1,000 times. Inside it smelled of industrial coffee and disinfectant. I found the director's office. A woman with a tired, intelligent face and hair pulled back in a severe bun looked up from a tower of paperwork. "Can I help you?" she asked, not unkindly, but not with an ounce of patience to spare. I'd like to volunteer," I said. "I work at the historical archive. I'm good with records, organizing." She gave me a long, assessing look. "I'm Maria," she said, extending a hand. "And we don't need archivists. We need people to serve hot meals, sort donations, and listen to women and children who have nowhere else to go. We're a shelter. Can you do that?" I nodded. "I can." For the next 2 weeks I lived a double life. By day, I was the pariah of Clear River. By night, I was just Sarah, the volunteer who quietly washed dishes and organized the donation closet at the shelter. Maria was tough, no nonsense, and saw everything. She didn't coddle, and she didn't judge. She was running a life-saving operation on a shoestring budget, fighting for women who had been told they were worthless, who had been betrayed by the people who were supposed to love them most. I felt more at home in that chaotic, underfunded building than I ever had in my parents' house. This was real community, not the suffocating obligation of blood. This was a choice. Friday finally came. My paycheck hit my account. I walked into the Clear River Community Bank with my head held high, a spring in my step. I was $700 richer, and every cent was going into the escape fund. I was rebuilding. I was winning. I handed my deposit slip to Jenny Peterson, who couldn't quite meet my eye. She fumbled with the slip. "Just 1 moment, Sarah," she murmured and disappeared into the back. My stomach went cold. She returned with Mr. Henderson, the bank manager, a man who golfed with my father. His face was a mask of grave professional concern. "Sarah," he said, ushering me into his glass-walled office. "Why don't you have a seat?" He shut the door. "There's been a situation with your savings account. We're flagging it as potential fraud." He slid a piece of paper across his desk. It was a wire transfer form dated 3 days ago. A debit, from my escape fund, for $22,000, the entire balance. I don't understand," I stammered, the room tilting. "I didn't authorize this." "That's the problem," Henderson said, pointing. "The signature. It's a very good match for yours." I looked. It was perfect. A flawless, practiced forgery of my own name. And the recipient, M. Anderson Holdings, LLC. My brother's shell company. I sank into the chair, the paper trembling in my hand. It was impossible. He couldn't have just taken it. Not without my passwords, my PINs. Henderson looked genuinely pained. The transfer was so large and to a new entity that our system required secondary verification. "We used the security question on your file." I stared at him, my blood turning to ice. I already knew. He pointed to a small box on the form just below the forged signature. The question was, "What was the name of your first pet?" My breath hitched. He read the answer printed in clean digital type. "Buster." I stopped breathing. Buster was a scruffy, one-eyed terrier mix I'd loved more than anything. He died when I was 12. Only 4 people on this earth had ever known that name. Me, Mark, Mom, and Dad. My mother used to say blood is thicker than water. She was right. It's heavier. It drowns you faster. And it leaves a stain you can't wash out. I drove to their house in a blind cold rage. I didn't knock. I used my old key and walked right in. They were in the kitchen, my father nursing a beer, my mother chopping vegetables, the picture of evening domesticity. They looked up startled, and my mother's face immediately hardened into a mask of grievance. Well, look who decided to… I didn't let her finish. I threw the wire transfer form on the kitchen table. It landed with a soft, damning thwack next to a pile of carrot peels. How could you… My voice was a raw whisper. My father David wouldn't look at it. He just stared into his beer bottle as if it held all the answers. My mother Carol didn't even flinch. She picked up the paper, glanced at it, and set it back down. Oh, Sarah, you're always so hysterical. He stole my money. I screamed, the sound tearing out of my throat, raw and animal. He stole $22,000. We were going to tell you, my father mumbled, finally looking up. His eyes were weak, pleading. It was just… the timing. Tell me what, I cried. That you helped him, that you gave him the answer to my security question, that you sat here and let your son rob your daughter. Now you listen here, Carol snapped, pointing her vegetable knife at me. Mark is in the middle of a very big, very important deal. He needed liquidity. It's an investment. He was going to put it all back, doubled. As if on cue, her phone sitting on the counter lit up. It was a video call. Mark. My mother sighed, a put-upon sound, and answered, propping the phone against the flour canister. Mark, honey, your sister's here and she's… Mark's face filled the screen, tan and breezy from a coffee shop in some anonymous sunny state. Hey, Sarah, heard you saw the good news? Look, I'm about to walk into a meeting, but don't you worry. You are in ground floor. You'll thank me when we're all rich. The casualness of it, the absolute unbothered arrogance broke something inside me. You stole it, Mark. I whispered, the words shaking. That was my life. That was my future. You committed fraud. He actually laughed, a short barking laugh. Oh, come on, fraud. Don't be so dramatic, Sarah. It's just a family loan. I borrowed it. I'll pay you back. God. I'm going to the police, I said, my voice flat. This is a crime. What you did is a crime. That's when my mother's voice cut through, sharp and cold as an ice pick. Stop it. I looked at her. Her face was a thundercloud of pure rage, not at him, but at me. You stop it right now, Sarah Anderson. You are not going to ruin him over a little money. He's your brother. He's out there trying. What are you doing, hiding in a basement with dead people's papers? We gave him the answer. Yes, we did. He was just so desperate, and you've always had enough. You've never been generous. I stared at her. The final rotten beam of the structure I used to call family crumbled into dust. They were all in on it. They didn't just let him, they helped him. They looked at my life, my one small precious escape plan, and saw it as nothing more than a resource for the son who mattered. They helped him steal my future. This was my lowest point. I had nothing. No money, no family, no future. The old Sarah would have crumpled. She would have dissolved into a puddle of tears on that kitchen floor, begging them to understand, to love her, to just see her. But the old Sarah was gone. She died the second my mother called me a burden, and this was just throwing dirt on the grave. A new Sarah stood in that kitchen, and she was cold. She was quiet. She looked at the three of them, her brother's glib, unbothered face on the screen, her father's cowardly, averted gaze, her mother's righteous, venomous anger, and she felt absolutely nothing. No, that's a lie. She felt a pure, clarifying, arctic rage. I reached out my hand, perfectly steady, and pressed the end call button on my mother's phone, cutting Mark off mid-sentence. Then I turned and walked out the door. I didn't go to the police. Not yet. The police were part of this town, part of their world. I went to the one place that was mine. I went to the archive. I sat in the silent, cold dark of the basement, surrounded by the ghosts of 100 other lives. And I remembered. My grandmother. My father's mother, a hard, stern woman who had seen my mother for the predator she was and had despised her for it. She had left me something Carol could never touch. For a rainy day, Sarah, she'd said, pressing the old-fashioned paper into my hand. A day when you need to buy your own damn sky. I had forgotten about them, tucked away in my own file not meant to mature for years. I pulled the file, and there they were. A small, neat stack of U.S. savings bonds left in my name alone. I spent the next 2 days liquidating them. The penalty for cashing them in early was steep, but I didn't care. It was enough. It was more than enough. I didn't call a local good old boy lawyer who would tell me to work it out with my family. I used the bond money to hire a litigator from Cleveland, a woman whose name I found on a forum for financial fraud victims. Her name was Evelyn Reed, and her hourly rate was terrifying. She met me via video call, her face sharp, intelligent, and utterly unsentimental. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I laid it all out, the 5 years of HELOC payments, the bank statements, the canceled checks, the wire transfer form, the forged signature, the secondary verification. I had a paper trail that could cut glass. Evelyn was impressed. "They committed wire fraud, Sarah," she said, her voice crisp. "This is a federal crime. We can have the U.S. Attorney's Office on this by noon." I looked at her. The thought of Mark in jail was unsatisfying. It was too fast. It was an ending, not a reckoning. "I don't want him in jail," I said. "Not yet. I don't just want my money back. I want everything. I want to file a civil suit. I want a lien. I want to freeze every asset he has and every asset they gave him. I want to build a paper wall so high he can never climb out." Evelyn Reed looked at me for a long, silent moment. Then for the first time she smiled. It was a thin, sharp, terrifying smile. "That," she said, "we can do." My family always talked about legacy. It was a word my mother loved, usually in reference to Mark. I was about to find out that legacy is just what's left behind when all the lies finally fall away. The legal battle began not with a bang, but with the quiet, efficient thud of a process server's knock. Evelyn Reed moved with a speed I found breathtaking. Mark was served at his condo in whatever sunny, soulless city he was in. The civil suit, with its attached motion for a preliminary injunction, was a masterpiece of cold legal fury. It cited wire fraud, conversion, and unjust enrichment. And it worked. The court immediately froze M. Anderson Holdings LLC, and with it every penny of my stolen future. My $22,000, plus the seed money from the second mortgage, was locked in legal limbo, poisoning Mark's venture from the inside out. My family was apoplectic. That's a clean, polite word for the kind of jagged, screeching rage that came through my phone in a dozen different voicemails. My mother left messages that swung wildly from tearful begging, "Sarah, please, you're destroying him," to venomous curses, "You were always a jealous, spiteful child." My father left just one. "Sarah, just call it off, honey. This is ugly. Let's just fix it." But he didn't say how. He didn't offer the money back. He just wanted the ugliness to go away. The town, of course, was viciously divided. My mother held court at the diner and the church, painting me as a cold, vindictive creature, a modern-day Goneril who was suing her own brother and kicking her poor parents while they were down. I was a pariah. I got looks at the grocery store that could curdle milk. "Can you believe it?" I heard Mrs. Gable whisper loudly to the butcher. "Suing her own blood. It's unnatural." I just kept my head down, put on my headphones, and walked. I let the paper wall Evelyn was building protect me. But as the civil suit ground forward, a second, more powerful bomb was ticking, one I had set and forgotten: the HELOC. Without my $450 month, the account had plunged into delinquency. And banks, unlike families, don't care about feelings. They don't care about golden boys or prodigal sons. They care about ledgers. And the ledger was bleeding. I was in the archive sorting through a box of century-old tax records when my phone buzzed with Evelyn's name. "I'm in a deposition," she said, her voice crisp, no preamble. But my paralegal just flagged something. You need to see this. An email popped up. It was a link to a public notice in the Clear River Gazette's online classifieds. My stomach turned to lead. Notice of sheriff's sale, case number charged 25 CV0189. Clear River Community Bank versus David A. Anderson and Carol T. Anderson. They've defaulted, Evelyn said, her voice flat. The bank moved for foreclosure on the HELOC, the one you co-signed. But I stopped paying, I said, my voice small. You thought they'd pick up the payment, Sarah. They didn't. They let it default. Looks like they've received multiple notices. The bank's patience ran out. I scanned the text, my eyes finding the date. The auction, I whispered, my blood running cold. It's in 2 weeks. Correct, Evelyn said. They're going to lose the house. I hung up the phone and stared at the white, sterile wall of the archive basement. They were going to lose the house I'd paid for 5 solid years, the house they used as collateral to get money for Mark. The house they were willing to leverage again to ruin me all while calling me a burden. The house was the weapon they'd used against me, and now it was the one that was going to destroy them. The irony was so bitter it almost made me laugh. I thought of Maria down at the shelter fighting to keep the lights on, and the roof from leaking over the heads of women and children who had nothing. And here was this 3-bedroom monument to my family's greed about to be sold off to the highest bidder. A strange, cold calm settled over me. This wasn't just a consequence, it was an opportunity. That night I called Evelyn back. My lawsuit against Mark, I said, pacing my small apartment. When we win, is it enough to get my money back? Win. Evelyn's voice was dry. He's not fighting, he's crumbling. His lawyer is already talking settlement. He wants his remaining assets unfrozen. To get that, he has to make you whole. I made sure damages were included in the complaint for your 5 years of HELOC payments. Yes, you'll get your money. All of it. Good, I said, stopping at my window looking out at the quiet, dark street. I have a new job for you. The auction, for the house. You want to stop it, she asked. No, I said. I want you to tell me how I can anonymously buy a house at a foreclosure auction. There was a long pause. I could almost hear the gears turning in her sharp legal mind. A shell corporation, she said, her voice suddenly alive with a new dangerous interest. We can set up an LLC. It'll be the bidder. Completely anonymous, untraceable back to you. The next 10 days were a blur of legal paperwork. Evelyn was a machine. She created Clear River Holdings LLC, a name so bland and corporate it was perfect. The day before the auction, Mark's lawyer, desperate to stop the bleeding, finalized the settlement. $22,000 plus another $27,000 in damages for the HELOC payments, my $450 a month for 5 years, with interest landed in my trust account. $49,000. I stared at the balance. It was more than my escape fund. It was a war chest. What's the opening bid on the house? I asked Evelyn. The bank just wants its money back, she said. The outstanding HELOC balance plus fees. It'll be low, very low. I took a deep breath. Wire the entire settlement, I said. All $49,000. Wire it from the trust directly into the new bank account for Clear River Holdings. I wasn't just getting my money back. I was leveraging it. My father used to tell me, home is the one place they have to take you in. He was about to find out what it costs when they kick you out. The auction was held on the cold, sterile steps of the county courthouse. It was a Tuesday just after 10 a.m., with a watery November sun that offered no warmth at all. I was there in the back, standing by a barren oak tree. I wore a hat, sunglasses, and a heavy wool coat, just another anonymous face, in the small crowd of bottom feeders and bank reps. My heart was a cold, heavy hammer against my ribs. Evelyn Reed. My lawyer was at the front. She looked impeccable, sharp in a dark gray suit, her briefcase resting by her feet. She was the agent for Clear River Holdings, just another professional here to do a job. And then there were my parents. They stood off to the side looking small, gray, and utterly defeated. They were a decade older than they'd been at Thanksgiving. My mother, Carol, was pleading with the bank's representative, a man in a shiny suit who was studiously avoiding her gaze, checking his watch. My father, David, just stood there, hands jammed in his pockets, staring at a crack in the courthouse steps. He looked like a man who had already lost. Mark, of course, was nowhere to be seen. He had lit the fire and was letting them burn. The auctioneer, a man with a bored, monotone voice, droned through two other properties, a vacant lot, a duplex, before he got to the main event. All right, next up, case number 2025 CV0189, property located at 142 Willow Lane. He read the legal description, a dry, rattling list of lot lines and parcels. We have an opening bid set by the plaintiff. We're starting at $42,750. That was it. The outstanding balance on the HELOC plus fees. A few local developers' men I'd seen my whole life perked up. This was a steal. I've got 43, one of them, a man named Miller, said, barely raising his hand. 44, another one countered. 45, Miller grunted. 46, Miller sighed. 48, the other man shook his head, backing down. $48,000, the auctioneer droned. He looked at Miller. Going once. Evelyn, who had been staring at the steeple of the church across the street, raised her paddle. It wasn't a wave, it was a crisp, mechanical motion. 50,000, she said, her voice clear and bored, cutting through the murmurs. Miller turned annoyed. A new player. 51, he grunted, looking her over. Before the word was fully out of his mouth, Evelyn's paddle was back up. 60, she stated. It wasn't a bid, it was a fact. There was no excitement, no hesitation. She didn't even look at Miller. She was looking through him. He saw it. He saw the expensive suit, the total lack of emotion, the Cleveland briefcase. He was a flipper looking for a bargain. She was a shark, and this was blood in the water. He let out a gust of air, annoyed. Nah, he said to the man next to him, and shook his head, backing down. The auctioneer's eyebrows shot up. This was more action than he usually saw. $60,000, he called out, his voice suddenly engaged. Going once. He looked at the huddle of developers. No one moved. Going twice. He looked at my parents. My mother was staring at Evelyn now, her face pale and confused, as if she couldn't understand who this woman was, or why she would pay so much. Sold. The gavel cracked a sharp, clean sound like a bone snapping. For $60,000 to Clear River Holdings, LLC. The moment the word sold hit the air, my mother made a sound. It wasn't a cry or a word. It was a wail, a thin, high animal sound of pure, uncomprehending loss. It tore through the sterile morning air and then was gone. My father didn't make a sound at all. He just deflated. Like a puppet with its strings cut, he slumped forward, bracing himself against one of the cold stone pillars, his shoulders heaving. I didn't watch them for long. I saw Evelyn as calm as if she'd just bought a cup of coffee walk forward to sign the papers. I turned, my legs shaking, and walked away. My sunglasses fogged up in the cold, but I didn't stop. No one saw me. I was just a ghost disappearing around the corner. The eviction notice was posted the next day. A bright neon orange sticker slapped onto the center of the front door of 142 Willow Lane. Notice to vacate. Occupants have 30 days to vacate the premises by order of the new owner. The owner was listed as Clear River Holdings, LLC. And just like that, the town which had been so quick to brand me a monster rallied. They rallied completely, around my parents. The narrative was perfect, irresistible. Poor, gentle Carol and David, hard-working town staples, had been devoured by a faceless corporation, a predatory, out-of-town developer from the city. I was just the appetizer. This was the main course. My mother, a brilliant tactician of her own victimhood, made her final perfect move. She and my father, looking frail, broken, and artfully bewildered, were on the front page of the Clear River Gazette, The headline was pure local outrage, local family devoured by corporate vultures. The article was a masterpiece of half-truths. We just, we don't understand, my mother sobbed to the reporter, her hand on my father's arm. We tried so hard, and with our poor, troubled daughter Sarah abandoning us in our time of need, we have no one. We have nowhere to go. She was setting the stage, painting a masterpiece of her own suffering. She had no idea I was the one who owned the canvas, the paint, and the theater. My family was so busy building a narrative they never stopped to think I might be the one holding the pen. The town, fueled by my mother's tearful performance in the Gazette, was in an absolute uproar. A special town hall meeting was called, not for the budget or the failing sewers, but to discuss the vulture capitalism that was destroying the very fabric of Clear River. It was a public execution, and Clear River Holdings was the guest of honor. The high school gymnasium was packed. It was hot, loud, and smelled of stale coffee, wet wool, and a kind of sour collective righteousness. This was my town, a hydra of gossip and judgment, and they were all here united in their outrage. And there in the front row were the primary victims. My parents and Mark arranged like a tragic tableau. My mother Carol was in her Sunday best, dabbing at her dry eyes with a crumpled tissue, a portrait of wronged, frail motherhood. My father David sat beside her, looking hollowed out and gray, a man just being swept along by a current he was too weak to fight. And Mark the architect of all of it, was there. He'd flown back not for the auction, but for this, his public absolution. He wore a respectable dark sweater, his face a mask of pained, noble concern for his poor parents. They were the holy trinity of victimhood, and the town was eating it up. Mayor Henderson was at the podium, his face ruddy, pounding his fist. He was on a roll. This Clear River Holdings, he boomed, his voice echoing off the cinderblock walls. This is a cancer, a faceless predatory entity from the city coming in here, preying on our most vulnerable, preying on our neighbors. He gestured dramatically to my family. A roar of angry agreement went up. Shame! Someone shouted from the bleachers. We won't stand for it. I was standing in the back by the doors, my coat still on. I watched it all, my heart a cold, steady drum. I saw Maria from the shelter a few rows ahead of me, her arms crossed, a look of profound disgust on her face. She was here because the community center's budget was supposed to be discussed, but this performance had hijacked the entire agenda. I watched my mother place a trembling hand on Mark's arm, and he in turn nodded gravely, as if accepting the town's sympathy was a heavy, noble burden. That was it. That was the last straw. I started walking. I moved from the shadows by the door down the center aisle, my heels clicking on the polished hardwood floor. The angry murmuring died, replaced by a wave of confused, hissing whispers. "What is she doing here?" I heard Mrs. Gable hiss. "That's her. The nerve!" I didn't stop. I didn't look at the rows of shocked, familiar faces. I walked right past the front row, not giving them a single glance, and stepped up to the small wooden microphone set up for public comment. The gymnasium went dead silent. The only sound was the loud buzzing of the old fluorescent lights. Mayor Henderson stared at me, his mouth open, sputtering. "Miss Anderson," he said, trying to regain control. This is not the time. We are discussing a very serious—" "I'm Sarah Anderson," I said. My voice, amplified by the microphone, was perfectly clear, perfectly steady. It filled every corner of the hot, quiet room. "And I am Clear River Holdings." A collective, sharp intake of breath. It was a physical sound, a gasp from 200 people at once. I turned slowly and looked at my family. My father's face, already gray, went white as a sheet. He looked like he'd seen a ghost. Mark's jaw literally dropped, his concerned mask shattering into pure, unadulterated shock. And my mother stared at me with an expression of such pure, venomous hatred that it was almost a relief. The mask was finally completely gone. "You want to talk about destroying a family, Mayor?" I said, turning back to the microphone, my voice ringing with a cold clarity. Let's talk about it. For 5 years I paid the mortgage on that house. The whispers started again, but now they were confused, shocked. And for my service at Thanksgiving dinner, I was told I was just a burden. The silence was absolute. Then my escape fund, $22,000 I had saved, was stolen from me. Stolen by my brother. I pointed a single steady finger right at Mark. With the help of my parents who gave him the answer to my security question. The sound in the room was now a low, horrified buzz. People were turning, staring at my family, not with sympathy, but with a dawning, sick understanding. What you call predatory, Mayor, I said, my voice like steel. I call justice. I let that hang in the air. I let them all look at the real monsters. Then I took a breath. But I didn't come here to talk about my family. I came to talk about ours. I looked past the stunned mayor into the crowd and found Maria. Her eyes were wide, locked on mine. Maria, I called out, my voice softening just a fraction. The community shelter just lost its lease on the old bakery building, correct? Maria, speechless, could only nod. The entire town turned to look at her, confused. I turned back to the microphone, to the mayor, to the stunned, silent room. Then I have an announcement. As the sole owner of 142 Willow Lane, I am donating the property free and clear to the Clear River Women's Shelter. The room exploded. It was a roar, a wave of sound, not anger, but pure stunned applause that grew louder and louder. I wasn't finished. I raised my hand. The applause slowly died down, the entire town waiting. I looked for the last time at my family, at their white, horrified, defeated faces. It will be effective, I said, my voice carrying over the speakers, cold and final, as soon as the current tenants have been removed. It's funny. My whole life my family told me I was nothing. They were right. I was no one they recognized. I was someone new. The gymnasium didn't just applaud. It was an explosion. It was the sound of 100 tiny, vicious narratives collapsing at once, the sound of a town's allegiance shifting on a dime. I saw Mrs. Gable, her mouth a perfect O of shock, staring at my mother, not with pity, but with a dawning, delicious horror. I saw the mayor's face, once ruddy with manufactured outrage, now pale and slack-jawed. He knew in that instant that he had backed the wrong horse, that he had championed the villains. I saw my family. My father, a statue carved from ash. My brother Mark, his face a grotesque mask of disbelief. He looked like a man who had just watched his sure-thing bet get shot at the starting gate. And my mother. Her hatred was so pure, so potent, it was a physical force in the room. But it was powerless. The narrative was no longer hers to control. The applause wasn't just for me, it was for them. It was the sound of poetic justice, of a story finally reaching its correct, righteous end. I didn't stay. I didn't wait for the fawning or the apologies. I just gave a single small nod to Maria, whose face was streaked with tears, and I walked back up the aisle. This time, people didn't shrink away from me. They moved aside, watching me with a new, profound respect. The roar of the applause followed me out the door and into the cold, clean night air. The eviction, I learned later, was a quiet, pathetic affair. They weren't just evicted by Clear River Holdings LLC. They were evicted by their own actions. They were evicted by the truth. The town that had so eagerly rallied to their defense now treated them with a cold, contemptuous silence. No one offered them a place to stay. No one offered a word of comfort. The whispers that had once been my torment were now my avenging angels, dissecting my mother's lies, my father's weakness, and my brother's treachery at every coffee counter and post office in town. They had become the pariahs. They had been exposed as the community destroyers, and I, the unstable one, was the community builder. They were gone before the end of the month. I didn't know where, and I didn't care. The ledger was balanced. That was 3 months ago. The snows melted, the sluggish brown river thawed, and Clear River, Ohio began to feel like a place I could finally leave. Which is why I'm here in my small apartment for the last time. It's empty. The archive boxes are gone, the furniture sold. All that's left is one large suitcase by the door. On the kitchen counter next to my keys sits the Clear River Gazette. The front page photo isn't of a scandal. It's a picture of 142 Willow Lane. The house is bright white, the porch repaired. Volunteers, including Maria and a smiling Mrs. Gable, are planting flowers in the front yard. A new, beautifully carved wooden sign hangs where the house numbers used to be. It reads, "The New Hope Community House. A home for women and children. A place for people to live." My parents' legacy was a lie. This house, this hope was mine. I pick up my phone. My bank app shows a single healthy balance, my restored fund. It's not an escape fund anymore. It's just my money, my life. My car is sold. Tucked into my passport is a one-way bus ticket to Chicago. I'm not running from Clear River. I'm just going. I'm moving to a city where I can be an anonymous archivist, drink coffee without it being a newsworthy event, and finally breathe. I'm not going to escape. I'm going to live. I slip the phone into my pocket and zip up the final suitcase. I'm about to pick it up when the phone buzzes a single sharp vibration. I pull it out. A text from an unknown number. My fingers tremble just for a second. I open it. 5 words. "You will regret this." I don't need a name. I know the tone. It's not a threat, not really. It's a curse. It's the last desperate grasp of the old world, the final pathetic attempt to pull me back, to make me small, to remind me I was a burden. The old Sarah would have frozen. Her blood would have run cold. She would have been terrified. I just look at the words. Then I smile. It's not a happy smile. It's not a vengeful one. It's just a free one. My thumb hovers, and then I press delete. The message vanishes. I silence the phone, drop it into my purse, and pick up my suitcase. I walk to the door, open it, and step out into the hallway. I don't look back. I just walk down the stairs, out the front door, and into the bright, blinding, and beautiful sunlight, finally free. With her family's house now a place of healing, Sarah was finally free to build her own. What did you think of Sarah's final move? We read every single comment, so leave your thoughts below. Subscribe for more. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Radiance. We'll see you next time.